Hello world! Apologies that you had to wait a while for this video to be ready, but thanks for hanging in there. Anyway, if you're new to my videos, welcome. I make videos mostly on science and faith, and this one is part 2 of a series I made earlier in response to an atheist activist, Mr. Dan Barker. I have the link to part 1 of the series in the description below, so check it out if you've not done so already. And now, on to part 2 of my response to Mr. Barker.
The resurrection of Jesus Christ, the story of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, is the absolute worst example anyone could possibly give for the reliability of the Bible. And I'm not exaggerating. Let me tell you why I'm not exaggerating. Many stories in the Bible are given once or twice. The resurrection story is given 5 times. You can compare them. Scholars have never been able to reconcile those contradictory accounts of the resurrection of Jesus. And besides that, and there are many of them, was the tomb open or closed when the women arrived? What message did the angels give? How many angels were at the tomb? And so on. Besides that, we see through the development in the first century of the Christian myth that the earliest stories were simple. There were no angels. There were very few remarkable events. But as you go 10, 20, 30 years later, you find more and more until you get to the book of John, where you find these outlandish stories. What you see in the development of the resurrection story in the New Testament is the development of a legend, starting simple, growing over time, getting more and more fantastic. It's a mistake to treat those accounts as if they were flat, as if they all happened at one time. We can see before our eyes the development from a simple, unvarnished, perhaps some element of truth in some story about someone who may have spiritually ascended, like we say grandma died and went to heaven. Maybe the early apostles said Jesus died and went to heaven, but that exaggerated. So the resurrection of Jesus Christ is not evidence for a God. And even then, it would just be evidence that a man rose from the dead. How do you connect the dots?
Well, I have to confess that I stopped my previous video before this point so that I could spend some time reading up about this. Like I said, I am neither a Bible scholar nor a historian, so it is hard for me to make informed judgment about these claims that Mr. Barker made. I mean, let's face it, there are volumes and volumes of books written by experts with all kinds of great academic credentials that make claims both for and against the Bible. And I'm really not sure how I can make a definitive judgment without personally reading through all the arguments made on both sides and then being able to check the evidences myself. So I approached this topic with quite a bit of trepidation, and it definitely does not help that I was only initially aware of 4 accounts of Jesus' resurrection in the Gospels. And it was only after some frantic Googling that I realized that the 5th account was from Paul in 1 Corinthians. In fact, I also have problems seeing Mr. Barker's point that some of the stories of Jesus got more and more fantastic as more books of the Bible got written. I mean, all of them had angels and a dead person being brought back to life. They are all fantastic, or some might say miraculous. However, I guess I can give my take on the major point that Mr. Barker made about an inconsistent account of the resurrection in the Bible. Personally, I actually find it sort of reassuring that these inconsistencies exist. Okay, I imagine that many people must be freaking out right now, but just hear me out. Okay, so the Bible is supposed to be God-breathed, and it is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness. And it is also written by man. And as man, we are totally limited creatures, especially in comparison to God. So when we are presented with multiple accounts of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, it should be expected that everyone's account will be slightly different. I mean, even if we asked one person to give an account of an event in their past, what that person would say would likely be different, even if the main thing or things that happened would be the same. And this is the case we see in the Gospels. Some of the accounts included some events, some did not include them, some had a longer description of the event, and some were somewhat protracted. But ultimately, all the major events in Jesus' life were described, and having all four Gospels really helped us to see Jesus' life in greater detail. So the fact that minor discrepancies exist across these different accounts is sort of reassuring for me, because firstly, it demonstrated that the early church was indeed discerning enough to recognize that the divine nature of the gospel, such that they did not try to doctor the scriptures to remove or correct these incongruent passages, even if it might lead to less questions in the future. Secondly, I think this is also partly God's way of teaching us how to read the Bible. Sometimes it is easy to focus too much on certain passages or phrases in the Bible, or worse, to take them out of context. Therefore, to really understand what the Bible is trying to teach us, we sometimes need to also look at what other passages say about the subject. So it is less important to note how many angels the women saw when they went to Jesus' tomb, but that it was empty, that Jesus had risen and would later appear in person to hundreds of people.
We suffer also from a coherent definition of a God. We have a proposition: this house believes in God. What is that word? What does that word God mean? There are many, and I don't have time to go into much detail, but there are many incompatible properties that many theists assign to this deity, much like saying this deity is a married bachelor. Can a married bachelor exist? Logically, it cannot. And there are mutually incompatible characteristics of this deity that many theists have put forward that make it a married bachelor. For example, God is supposedly an omniscient being who has free will. But if you know the future, you can't have free will. I'm not talking about human free will, and that's a big debate whether we have it or not. Even atheists disagree among themselves. But God, presumably, this being is a personal being with free will who knows his own future decisions. In order to have free will, whatever that means, there has to be a period of indeterminacy during which you truly do have options. I could choose coffee or tea. I could choose this or that. But if you know your future options, you have no choice. You have no freedom. You are not a free personal agency. So if your definition of God is that God is omniscient and free, he cannot exist. He's a married bachelor. I know theologians try to tinker with definitions. By the way, if God cannot change what he knows he's going to do tomorrow at 12 noon, that also puts some limits on his omnipotence, doesn't it?
Well, what I would say is that what might seem impossible for us in our three-dimensional world does not mean that it is impossible for a being who is beyond this world. We might not be able to fathom how it works, but that's because our minds are also stuck in this reality. So just because it seems like it's impossible in our minds and in our reality, it does not mean that it is impossible for God. The way I'd like to think about it is that God, being omniscient, would know exactly what would happen in the future if certain actions were done, and then he can choose whichever pathway that yields the best outcome according to him. If anyone has seen the Avengers Infinity Wars movie, it's sort of like Doctor Strange looking through the millions of possibilities to find the best way to deal with Thanos. Of course, since God is also omnipotent, he can also just sort of change or create the future that he wants. So yeah, in my mind, I don't think there is necessarily any kind of paradox.
A lot of these arguments from design and teleology, for example, suffer from begging the question. It's rather like the man who is amazed. Look at how all these rivers were made to flow right along the state boundaries. How do you explain that? It must have been a massive feat of engineering, a huge economic development. How did they get those rivers to do that? Isn't that incredible? And yet that's how a lot of this teleological thinking is among how did the human eye evolve? How do you explain that? There must have been design behind it. It does look like design, doesn't it? Those rivers look like they were designed to flow right along those boundaries. It's an upside down kind of thinking, and in a sense begs the question the whole idea that in some of these teleological arguments that complexity requires a designer, and Richard, somewhere here, pointed out in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, anything that is complex enough to design functional complexity, any deity who could design has to have a mind that is at least as functionally complex as the thing that he designed, right? If your premise is that functional complexity requires a designer, if that's your premise, then the mind of that deity also must, by that premise, require a designer. And you get into this infinite regress of, well, then God needed a bigger God and a bigger God. I think most scientists prefer to just stop with what we do know rather than speculate endlessly about a mountain of turtles.
You know, this is one thing I agree with Mr. Barker. Let's just stick with what we know. Unfortunately, what we do know is that there is a lot we don't know. Science can help us to learn a lot about the world around us, but the more we research, the more we realize that reality is a lot more complex than we think. And more importantly, it cannot really help us to learn anything about the worlds beyond our own. However, the Bible does teach us what we need to know about things that science can't teach us. So I'm happy to focus on studying the world around us with science, and then the world beyond us through God.
Another lack that takes against the evidence for the existence of a God is the lack of agreement among believers. If there is a deity that you love and care about, why do no two believers agree on any social or moral issue? You name it. Gay marriage, doctor-assisted suicide, stem cell research, death, the war, you name these social issues we're struggling with. You find devout, praying, Bible-believing Christians on both sides of those issues. Paul wrote in the Bible, God is not the author of confusion. But can you think of a single book that's caused more confusion than that Bible? They don't agree. Why not? Why shouldn't it be clear? Why shouldn't this all-loving, all-caring deity make it clear to us? It is not. They have fought with each other over these issues. The 30 Years' War, which was based to some degree on the confessional differences over infant baptism and transubstantiation. People were killed. John Calvin had his friend Servetus killed over a simple misplacement of a preposition. The lack of agreement among believers is a serious problem towards the existence of an all-loving, all-caring God.
All I can say is that it is truly unfortunate that there are divisions between followers of Christ. It definitely does not seem like this is as intended. But could God have just made everyone be fully aligned and think the same way and do the same things all the time? Well, robots are definitely a lot easier to make and manage than humans. But God deemed that it was good to make man, limited as we are, with some level of free will. But this means that we are going to misinterpret the Bible and we are going to mess it up. The worst thing is that because man is rebellious and fallen, we will also end up using the Bible to attack each other. But this should not reflect on God. It's more a reflection about the selfish and fallen nature of man. Even for people who are Christian, we are still a work in progress, and we are not immune to temptations and sin. And so men will generally screw up and make mistakes, even terrible ones, and the ramifications can be devastating, especially if you're a man in power. But as I said earlier, this just shows that all men need help to do the right things.
And then, of course, the problem of evil. And our previous speaker pointed out that that is probably the Achilles heel in theology. All you have to do is walk into any children's hospital, and you know there's no God, at least no good God. Maybe there's an evil God. Those children are dying at the same random rate, even though their parents are desperately praying, desperately loving those kids, wanting some kind of divine intervention, and yet, as Ann Gaylor says, who's the former president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, nothing fails like prayer. That would be evidence. If you could give some scientific evidence that prayer actually makes an organic difference, not just makes you feel better, but an actual difference in the real world, that would be something to put on the table. The fact that that's not put on the table shows that prayer is pretty much talking to yourself.
I think one misconception that most people have about God is that he is some kind of giant Santa Claus in the sky, and that his job is really to grant wishes to everyone who prays to him. But what sort of God would he be if he's just there answering every single prayer he hears? He would be more like an enslaved genie in a bottle. Are we God's masters? Like I said earlier, we are men who are limited, lacking in understanding, and prone to failings. I don't think God should be answering our prayers willy-nilly. We learn from the Bible that God will not give us something that is bad for us, even if we prayed for it. We don't always know why He does not always answer prayers, but we do know that sometimes God answers prayers, but in His own time. And unfortunately, God does not conveniently drop us a memo to tell us that He has answered our prayers. So from an atheist point of view, there is no way to prove that God actually did answer the prayers, rather than having things just sort of fall into place on their own. But from a Christian perspective, or my perspective at least, praying gives me hope, and gives me a way to love someone I know who is in need of help, which unfortunately I'm not always able to render. And to know that God hears my prayers, that's just super comforting.
Finally, there's no need for a belief in God. Millions, tens of millions of people on this planet live happy lives, productive lives, moral lives, purposeful lives, lives of hope and meaning, without deluding ourselves that there are these invisible personalities populating some supernatural realm. We are quite happy, thank you, without that belief. Based on all of that, it is more likely to reject the proposition than to accept it. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to bring back some science here. I brought up the idea of the God center in the brain in my last video. It is the idea that our brain is somehow able to give us a sense of transcendence or some kind of super spiritual feeling when we engage in some religious activities. Now, I brought up this God center in the brain because Mr. Barker suggested that non-Christians can have similar experiences to Christians. And one reason is likely because all human beings probably have this God center in our brains. Anyway, if scientists believe that this God center did evolve in our brains, it generally would mean that this trait has persisted because it is adaptive, i.e., it helps with survival of an individual. We can also see that every single people groups in the past seem to have adopted some kind of religion. This corroborates with the idea that somehow religion does have a positive impact on human survival. Of course, this is oversimplifying matters, but it does suggest that biologically speaking, it would be good for man to have a religion. Of course, as a Christian, I can say that having a religion has been great. In particular, being a Christian has been the most purposeful and joyful, although not always painless experience in my life, more so than when I was not a Christian. So I would definitely suggest that anyone without any religion to give Christianity a try. You might be leading purposeful and happy lives right now, but you might find that being a Christian can bring more joy and purpose than ever before. Thank you so much for listening till the end of the video. I hope that some of the points I made has provoked some thoughts. For my non-Christian friends, I just want to emphasize that science can help us understand a lot of the world around us, but it cannot tell us anything about the world beyond us. Can you be absolutely sure that there is no God? And for my Christian friends, I just want to say that we can see the glory of God in the world around us, and so there is a lot we can learn about God through science. Speaking of which, my next video is not going to be a response video per se. I mean, I won't be responding to another video, but instead, I will be doing a Christian's perspective of Professor Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene. It is sort of an idea I had since I was a student, so stay tuned for that. Alright, thank you so much again, and God bless.